I'm going to be talking about ways to find alien life and what we should look for and how we can do it. If you have any questions, you're very welcome to write them in the chat during the talk or after, and we'll try to answer as best I can. The likely scenario is that if you have a question, someone else has the same question, so don't be shy. Okay, so a fundamental part of human nature, in my opinion, is to ask, are we alone? Is there anyone else there? I think humans have always explored other lands, other continents, and gained an understanding of the world in that sense. Sometimes you understand yourself by understanding others, understanding what you are not. Just getting a feeling for how we fit in to this giant universe is something I think drives a lot of people. And to me, both the idea that there might not be anything and that we are alone is equally mind-blowing as thinking there are just numerous other civilizations that we can find, hopefully. It is a sort of topic where astronomy and philosophy intersect. And as technology has advanced, more and more of these questions that we have asked can now actually be tested. It used to be mostly philosophy, now it's actually becoming science. So that's great. We live on a small planet in a very, very big universe. We have here a sketch of the solar system with the 8 planets. Sorry, can you see my cursor actually?
Yes.
Yeah.
Nice. Okay. So you see here the solar system. This is just a sketch because the sun is way too big to be shown like this. And also things are way farther apart than is possible to show on a screen. But the relative sizes of the planets here in our solar system are correct. So we are here, we're the 3rd planet from the sun, and we are quite small compared to these other planets. But we are even smaller when we think about where we are in our galaxy, the Milky Way. We are one tiny pinprick there. This is also just an artist's illustration. We can't see the Milky Way because we're inside it. And when we look at a tiny little fraction of the sky, a fraction much smaller than the moon, for instance, we see just so many different galaxies. This is a picture from Hubble, the Hubble telescope. And all these little fuzzy patches here are separate galaxies. So we think in the Milky Way there are about 150 billion stars. And that's just one galaxy. So imagine all of these galaxies with all of these stars. And around all of these stars are enormous amounts of planets, really. We thought for a long time that there would be other planets than those in our solar system. These are called exoplanets. But we hadn't been able to find any with the technology we had. And 25 years ago, we could finally find the first one in 1995. And since then, we have discovered about 5,000 that have been confirmed. So now we have very hard evidence that planets are very normal out in the universe. And if you think about there being about 100 billion stars in one galaxy and these many, many billions of galaxies, and the fact that statistically each star has one planet around it, then that becomes a whole lot of planets. These planets may have moons as well. And we are living in an extraordinary time in history where we can explore what these planets are made of and what their atmospheres are, and possibly even see signs that life is present or has been present in these places. This is something that we could never do before. So it's super exciting, really. We have all these opportunities, all of these places to look at. But all we know of life is still something we know from looking at Earth. Every bacterium, every animal, every tree, everything we've ever discovered is on Earth. There is a huge diversity in the life that we have found here, but it is limited as well. So what we want to try and do is take something that's very specific, Earth, and generalize from that. We want to figure out what kind of general things, general chemistry perhaps, or general physical things would be common for all life in the universe. That would inform us about where to look and how to look. The first problem you run into with this approach is that we don't really know what life is. Here I've shown you, first off, a few images of something that we know on Earth. Here is a virus that you may or may not know is the coronavirus. Here are some bacteria. On the bottom row are different illustrations of what the pop culture has thought aliens might look like. We are perhaps again limited by what we ourselves look like, but there is a bit of diversity here. But when we try to define what life is, to have a proper definition, we sort of come up short. We could maybe, as a first idea, think, okay, life is something that breathes, but then we run into trouble with first explaining like what do you breathe? We breathe oxygen. Some microbes breathe hydrogen. Trees could be said to breathe CO2. Tardigrades, these tiny little animals, also called water bears, can live in vacuum where they don't breathe for several days and still come back to life and feel just fine. So that might not be exhaustive. Life may be something that moves, but there are different corals and sponges in the ocean that grow on other things and don't move by themselves. Life could be something that reproduces, but if we then look at what viruses are, I mean, they reproduce, but only when they're inside a cell of something else. And also some things can't reproduce. So it's, yeah, that's also not quite clear. Maybe life is something that evolves. The trouble here would be that we observe another planet or another place only for a very short amount of time. So even if that were the case, then we wouldn't be able to see it. So maybe we need several different of these categories to be fulfilled at once. Excuse me. Not corona. Okay. So the solution to this problem with not knowing what life is for an astronomer is just to skip that question entirely. Let's not think about what life is. Let's instead just think about how we can look for something that we know is life. And for doing this, we involve a concept called biosignatures. A biosignature is any kind of sign that life is or has been there, even though we can't see life itself. Over here, I'm showing you a footprint. If you were to go walking in a forest and see a footprint like this, you wouldn't have to actually see a human being to know that a human being has been there. And that is basically what a biosignature is. So we can have both physical biosignatures. We can also have chemical ones, any kind of chemistry that would tell you, okay, there has been some kind of creature here. You can think about biosignatures or how you would analyze them in different ways. If you were able to go somewhere and look at a part of a planet or part of a moon, then you have some different options for discovering biosignatures. Of course, if you go somewhere like Mars, for instance, and you see one of these green little guys come up and wave at you, then you're pretty certain you found life, right? But it can also be smaller things. it can be something like a stromatolite, which I'm showing here to the left. Stromatolite is made from bacteria that form these sheets of minerals, so sheets of rocky material, and they stack upon each other and glue together, basically. And this happens over many, many years, and it can happen in a seabed, for instance, and once the water clears, you'll be left with this kind of rock with these layers inside that prove that bacteria have been present here. We can also find a fossil. Here is a mold fossil of a kind of mollusk or mussel. It's 300 million years old. What happens here is that some kind of hard material, like the shell of a mussel, for instance, is surrounded by rocky material, which presses down on it. And the organic matter itself, the shell, then decomposes over time, and water flushes through that space and rinses it out. And you're left with an imprint or a mold of what that looked like. This up here is a picture of onion cells. And of course, if we saw some cells actually moving around, then that would be amazing, because we would see that not only has life existed before, but it actually exists now. And even though it might just be cellular life, the idea that life can arise somewhere else in the universe is enormous, right? Because right now we don't know if we are one of a kind, if life only started once in the history of the universe, or if there are just countless other times where it arose as well. And if we know for a fact that life can arise once here and once somewhere else, that really gives us a good clue. Okay, if it can happen more than once, it can happen again in all these billions of planets that we see. So that would be really cool. We haven't really gone to that many places in our solar system. Of course, it's not really possible to go beyond the solar system yet. So humans, besides being on Earth, have been to the moon, and that's it, unfortunately. We have sent different robots to different other locations, which is also great, because they can take samples of the different rocks or surfaces and send back or analyze where they are. Up here to the left is a moon rock. It's called Great Scott, which is quite fun. It was brought back by the Apollo astronauts from Apollo 11 in 1969, the first time humans were on the moon. Up here is a picture of an asteroid called Bennu. It was visited by a lander only a few weeks ago, a lander called OSIRIS-REx. And this lander's purpose was to touch down briefly on the surface, then blow up some of the dust and the rocks from the surface and grab those in this arm that we see here. I'm going to show you a really cool movie in just a bit of this arm approaching the surface and whirling up the dust and moving away again. I can show you here while I talk about it a bit. Okay, so we're coming closer to the ground and we're adjusting the camera. And there we go. I think that's super cool. This movie is sped up, so in reality, it stood on the surface for about 6 seconds. So when it hit the surface, it sprayed out nitrogen gas, and then all this stuff that whirled up, it caught in this robot arm here. And it has now sealed it in a package and is shipping it back to Earth. So we can take a look at that material, see what kind of isotopes are there, so different versions of the same atom or different molecules. And we can analyze, because we know from Earth that life prefers different isotopic ratios or different compositions of atoms. So we can analyze what kind of material is here, if it's suitable for life, for instance. If we're looking from farther away, because as I said, there are very few places that we have actually been to. We can instead look at spectra. So a spectrum is just a way of looking at the light that comes from something. And with that light, we can then say what is the elements, the atoms and molecules that are in this atmosphere, this gas, or in this material. There's a sketch here to the left with the light coming in, going through a prism. That prism could be exchanged for a telescope, or the prism could be inside the telescope. And then it's being split into these different colors. The colors represent different wavelengths. So the split happens because there is light of different wavelengths in this total white light over here, and it's then split into short wavelengths, which will look bluer, all the way to red wavelengths, which are longer, and beyond those as well, infrared, ultraviolet are also part of this, and beyond those. Now, what is really cool about this is that each element and each molecule has their own fingerprint in the spectrum that we get out. So you can see again here, we go from short wavelengths here to long wavelengths here. And the element of helium, for instance, it shows this spectrum, but it also shows these lines, these spectral lines, where no light is passing through. This pattern of lines is unique to helium. No other atom or molecule looks the same way. Here we have for oxygen and for neon, argon, and xenon. And this is really helpful for us because it means we can look at a gas, and if we see the pattern of neon, for instance, we can say, okay, that gas contains neon. It's in reality, it's more complex than this. It takes a lot of careful analyses and a lot of weeding out of things you don't want to look at, but it is possible to do. When we want to look at atmospheres of planets or moons, we usually use what is called transmission spectroscopy. So there's one thing we need for this to be able to get done, and that is for the planet to go in front of the star we're looking at. So we need to have some kind of star we're looking at and a planet that crosses that star relative to where we're looking. Because when it does that, the starlight goes through the atmosphere of the planet, and when it reaches us, the gas in that atmosphere has absorbed some of the light. So we get these, again, black bands or black spectral lines in the spectrum. This works for exoplanets. It's what is mostly done for exoplanets. It also works for solar system planets, but there you would usually take a different kind of spectrum because it's easier for when things are close by. Again, this is not easy to do, but it is doable, and the technique is being developed. If we look at the Earth, we see, just checking that. Okay, good. I just got a text and I wanted to make sure that it wasn't from Philippa saying I was offline. But if we look at the transmission spectrum of the Earth, for instance, we see some really good biosignatures here. Here's our atmosphere, it's lovely. This is a spectrum. Again, now it's not colored, but it goes from the short wavelengths to the long wavelengths. So from blue over here to red over here. And there is a kind of basic spectrum here, which shows all the colors. And then we have these black lines corresponding to these spectral lines. And you can see very clearly here that there are some elements that give each of their fingerprint to the spectrum. There's a lot of oxygen. The oxygen comes mainly, or almost exclusively actually, from photosynthesis on our planet. So plants turning carbon dioxide and sunlight, energy from the sun and water, into oxygen. This is a pretty good biosignature, to be honest. I'm going to come back to in a little bit why it might not be enough, but it's definitely a good signature in our atmosphere. There are a lot of spectral lines belonging to water here. That is mainly caused by the oceans evaporating. So there's this whole water cycle where water evaporates from the ocean, condenses into clouds, and rains down again, and then it goes on. This is not in itself a biosignature because it's not made by something living, but water is really neat to have on a planet. And I'll come back to why it's neat. There are also some signs of carbon dioxide. You can see one spectral line here, another one here. Carbon dioxide is made when we breathe out, but it's also made in industry, of course. We know that it's a powerful greenhouse gas, and in our atmosphere, we definitely see the traces of that as well. Methane, or CH4 here, carbon with 4 hydrogen atoms, and here, is really cool to see in our atmosphere. It comes almost only, from biological sources. So that's a really good biosignatures. It comes mainly from cows burping. So a lot of farming is responsible for this methane spectral line, or these methane spectral lines. Now, as I mentioned before, it might not be enough to have just one type of biosignature. What we really need is a combination. For instance, if we look at oxygen, we could say it comes from photosynthesis, and that might be right. But if we look at another planet that has oxygen in its atmosphere, that might also come from something else. If that planet had an ocean, for instance, and that ocean evaporated, maybe it was very close to its star, then the atmosphere of it would contain a lot of oxygen. And when we looked at that planet, then if we immediately thought, oh, life is there, then we would be wrong. So other things can mimic these things. So it's important to take a combination. For instance, if we have, like we have in our Earth, on our Earth, CO2 as well as methane, then that's a really good biomarker, those two together, or biosignature. So carbon dioxide is a molecule that carbon just really, really loves to go to. If there is some methane produced on a planet, then usually all of that carbon would just swoop right up and become carbon dioxide. For us to be able to see a methane signature spectral line here as convincing, as obvious as that, it means that there must be a lot of extra production of methane. And the only thing we really know of that could do that is life. So those two in combination with each other is a pretty strong biosignature. There have also been other things from exoplanets, or other transmission spectra from exoplanets that we can look at. Here is the artist's impression of an exoplanet called WASP 19b, a lovely name here. We don't know exactly what it looks like. We just know that it reflects a lot of light. It's just shown here to illustrate the scale compared to Jupiter. The transmission spectrum here looks a bit more complicated than Earth's, but it does show a number of features. It shows sodium here, which is part of salt. It shows a lot of titanium oxide on Earth that goes into titanium dioxide, which is used in medicine and in white paint as well. We don't see that in our atmosphere, but it's present here. We also see water. So there is water vapor, gas, in the atmosphere of this exoplanet, which is super cool. Also because that exoplanet is really, really close to its star. So we know that for Earth, it takes 1 year to go around once the star. For this exoplanet, it takes 19 hours. So it's super, super close, and still it has this water vapor, which is great. If we wanted to look at solar system planets, we would probably, instead of transmission spectra, use reflected light spectra. These are probably, well, not probably, they are easier to look at if you are close by. Reflected light is just light coming from the star. Here, again, this is just an artist's impression. Coming from the star, bouncing off that planet and hitting our eyes or our telescopes. It's the same as you see in your living room. You see a chair, that's because light hits the chair and it goes into your eyes. This is easy to do in the solar system. We just wait until it's nighttime and then we look at a planet farther away from the sun, and there we can see the reflected light of that. For exoplanets, it is much more difficult because they are so close to their stars. When we look far away, they're basically in the same spot, and because they are so very faint compared to their stars. So this can be very challenging with exoplanets, so far at least. But what is really cool about these reflection spectra, besides the fact that you can also see different elements in them, is something like this over here to the right, where where a researcher, I don't remember if he's maybe a PhD student or maybe a professor, but he made this interesting analysis that showed that the reflected light of a planet that has land mass here will actually differ when we talk about whether that planet has plants on it, so plant life. The reflection spectrum will look different if we look at rocks on the land surfaces or different types of plant life on the surfaces. So just looking at the reflected light can actually tell us there might be trees here. So that's great, again. But we need to be very careful about the assumptions we make and need to be very aware of what kind of planet we're looking at, what the temperature is, for instance, whether there are clouds in the atmosphere that might disturb our vision. So now we know sort of what things to look at, right? We need to look at maybe oxygen, CO2, methane, things like that would be great. Now we need to know where to look for them, because not all planets or moons are created equal. It might be that they have these things in their spectra or on their surfaces, but there still is not able to be any kind of life there. One of the things that is often said to be a prerequisite for life is liquid water, and there is good reason for that. Liquid water, the reason I call it liquid water is just that sometimes we also talk about water ice or water vapor, but just water as we know it. It has a lot of different functions in our bodies and outside our bodies. So in our bodies, it helps regulate the flow of different nutrients in and out of the cells. It also helps in many processes building the cells and maintaining them. Outside our bodies, it is, well, also inside, it's a great solvent, meaning that a lot of the nutrients and molecules that we need to have transported around can be dissolved in water and that way can be transported around. Water is also liquid at a large temperature range, which is again great, very convenient. It's liquid at the temperature where most chemical reactions are efficient or have high rates. So that makes liquid water very useful for a lot of things that uses chemical reactions, like metabolism, for instance. It also binds very easily to other molecules. It's very stable, and there is a lot of it. There is a lot of hydrogen and a lot of oxygen in the universe. The thing that matters most when it comes to whether or not a planet can have liquid water is temperature. So as a first point, it would be how far are we from the star, but there can also exist liquid water on places that might otherwise be too cold, for instance, if they have a large greenhouse effect. Besides liquid water, we also want to make sure that the star type is suitable for life. Some stars, like our sun, are pretty friendly, easygoing stars. Other stars are really violent. They throw out material that can fry a planet. They might throw out big magnetic storms. They might throw out a lot of UV radiation or X-ray radiation, which would completely sterilize the planet. So we don't imagine that's very good for any kind of life. We're also going to be looking at the smaller rocky planets. Here's Mars, beautiful image. The bigger planets will have accreted a big gas atmosphere, right? And some planets will not even have a surface. It will just be gas all the way through. And although there might be pockets where life could exist, maybe bacterial or a microbial life, we don't think it's very likely. So we would rather look for the smaller rocky places. Finally, we need to look at a place that has the correct building blocks for life. Again, this is, of course, based on Earth life, right? But it is something that we think, with good reason, is quite general for life. So these 6 atoms here, these 6 elements, make up all biomolecules, all molecules in the body. Carbon in particular is really important. Carbon is great at forming very strong bonds to other atoms, and it forms very big molecules which can carry a lot of information, and it also is very common in the universe. All of these are actually very common, which, I mean, it's probably why life takes advantage of it. But these 6 comprise all protein, sugars, lipids, DNA, everything. So we think that even though it's possible to think up different kinds of life, these just have really big advantages. So that's why we would, at least at first, probably focus on places that have these building blocks. I'm going to end by showing you some places that could potentially be habitable. First off is my new favorite object in the solar system, well, apart from the Earth, but other than that, we have Enceladus here, which is a moon of Saturn. It is a very icy world. It has a thick layer of ice, and for a long while we thought it's just a cold lump. But there are these tiger stripes, they're called, these blue stripes here on the bottom, which are cracks in the surface that go down to a subsurface ocean that sprays up hot water. You can see that from this image here. These jets, or plumes as they're called, are just fountains of hot water and organic molecules spraying out into space. The reason Enceladus is hot enough to do this is because Saturn is close by and really, really big. So it pulls on it and it compresses it, and it pulls and compresses. So the material grinds against each other itself and produces these very hot water reservoirs. And when you fly a probe through it, you can see there is water and there is organic molecules and there is CO2, which is amazing because on Earth we have something similar called hydrothermal vents. these are places in the ocean where small sprays of dusty and warm material comes up. Dusty is good in this sense because it means it's full of nutrients, full of organic molecules. And you can see there's just a whole plethora of bacteria and microbes and crabs that live here because there's just so much food for them. There is even some scientists that believe that life may have started near hydrothermal vents on Earth. This is a really interesting object to go and look closer at. Mars may not be habitable now, we're not quite sure, but we know for certain that liquid water has existed on its surface. Mars used to have an atmosphere, which it doesn't anymore, but there are definite signs of water being there. And also, if it had an atmosphere in the past, maybe it would have been a planet that was actually habitable. And there are a lot of different rovers or robots that have been sent to the planet to try and analyze things more. Here is the Mars Pathfinder taking a selfie. And Mars is also interesting because we might go there in the hopefully not too far future. Europa over here is another moon, this time from Jupiter. It also has liquid water underneath the surface, similar to Enceladus. The reason it's interesting is that just the amount of water it has twice the water that the Earth has. It also has organics underneath it, so that would also potentially be a really good place for life to start or to exist. There are also other places, other moons in particular in our solar system that might be more suited for life than we thought initially. When we then look outside our solar system, we see a bunch of planets that are deemed potentially habitable. Here are, I think, 24 shown, and some of our solar system planets for scale. There are about 60 now classified as potentially habitable, which is of great interest, of course, and super cool. And we definitely want to study those further. However, I just have to say a few things here. First of all, these planets could be rocky like Earth. This is one of the criteria for them being potentially habitable. We think they're rocky based on their densities, but these measurements are not very certain, at least not always. So we're not quite sure. We're also not quite sure whether their atmospheres, if you just have a density, it's difficult to say whether something is perhaps sort of dense all the way through, or if it has a small core that is very dense and then a huge atmosphere. That's one thing. They also could have liquid water. This is based on the analysis of the planet itself, where it is related to the star and what kind of atmosphere it may have, if we know that. But it's not certain. Just because a planet is at the right distance to have liquid water doesn't mean it has it. Finally, very important thing, habitable does not equal inhabited. A planet may have all the ingredients for life and still not have aliens, which is sad to me, but it's the truth. We need to be careful about what we deem inhabited. If we get there, right, we need to. There's a lot of physics we don't know as well, but even if we get all that right, then habitable is still different from inhabited. I'm going to leave you with this picture of the Earth, because as I said, every kind of life we know is here. Every kind of life we know that has ever existed has been here. But there are billions of other worlds. And even though it is easy to just focus on where we are. This is just a time of exploration. This is such an exciting time scientifically because we're just now getting started where we can see what kind of things are in the atmospheres of other planets. We can go to different places in our solar system. We know that there are several different interesting objects, and technology is just now catching up to what we want to do. So these years are going to be just super exciting. And I think with that, I'd like to end and take any questions you have. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Maria. It's very interesting.
Cool.
So is there any questions? Maria, do you see in the chat, or should I read it to you?
Let's see. Now I see it.
Hmm?
Yes, the latest find regarding Venus. Yes, I can say something. This is a good question. So a few weeks ago, I think, there was a claim of a detection of phosphine on Venus. Phosphine is a very toxic gas to us, but it is also a gas that is maybe almost unique in that it is a biosignature in itself. There is almost nothing we know of that can produce phosphine unless it is life. And so people thought that they had found phosphine on Venus, which of course sent everyone into a frenzy, myself included, because that would just be so cool. And Venus is just next to Earth. It's so easy to go there. And even though Venus has this huge and thick and poisonous to us atmosphere, it's possible that there were these clouds containing phosphine where bacterial life could survive. But what has now happened is, I think, two scientific articles have reanalyzed the data and have not found phosphine in it. So right now there's a discussion going on about the data analysis. As I mentioned a few times, I think things are not really very clear cut when we look at spectra from different places. It is very difficult to disentangle the small signal that you want out. And so right now there is a discussion in the scientific community about whether or not the phosphine is actually there. And I think my personal opinion is that it's probably leaning towards it not being there, unfortunately. But I mean, we still want to go to Venus.
Yeah, that was sad.
It was, yeah.
Any more questions? Okay. Then, yeah.
I have a question actually.
Yes, good.
Last minute. Thank you, first of all, Maria, for the very interesting talk. It's quite fascinating to think about this alien life and how to find out. I was wondering a question that looks a bit into the future, but let's say that we find the presence of alien life in some exoplanets. What would be the way to communicate with this kind of life to see if they can reply or if it's some intelligent form of life or not?
Oh, that's such a good question.
If you ever wondered about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Because one point is, of course, if it's an exoplanet, it takes a long time for any information to come back and forth. But we would probably use radio signals, maybe send out in a specific sequence to let them know that we are here. And hopefully we would send a probe towards them. We are limited by the very short lifetime of human beings. Things are just so far apart for us small things to travel. If it were a signal from the solar system, I really hope that people would just get going right now, right? Send a probe, send something, send a little blinking thing, anything, right? Usually telescopes take years and years and years to get done, but I think if we found a signal, then we should get going. I imagine it would also be a process of elimination, basically. If we found a signal, even if it's very strong, then we would probably have a process of, well, let's rule out this thing, let's rule out this thing, how about that thing? So it would take a while, but I would say send a probe immediately.
Yeah. It's if it's within the solar system, it would be quite fast to communicate, because I recall it's 8 minutes the light takes from the sun to the Earth, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And
yeah, I think it's only a few hours from the sun to Pluto. So
yeah. And what about exoplanets in the solar neighborhood? Is that so much longer?
The closest star to us actually has an exoplanet, but that is 4 light years away. And of course, we can't travel anything like light speed. We can send out signals.
It still take for 4 years.
Yeah. So it's a long distance relationship.
Yeah. I guess it will require multiple generations to carry out a conversation.
So. Yeah, it's so sad. People are so short-lived.
Yeah. Or maybe we will manage to live longer, but that's more.
Yeah. Yeah, I bet if you told someone from the 1700s what we can do now, they would have think it's just science fiction as well. So maybe.
Who knows? Thanks.
You're welcome. See, there's another question.
Yeah, and
yeah. Do you think we will get a definite detection of an extraterrestrial biosignature in our lifetime? Oh, I so hope so. I'm not sure it will be definite. I think it will be, as I mentioned, a gradual process. I think it also will be, because it would be such an extraordinary claim, it would have to withstand a lot of scrutiny. Just like when Einstein proposed his theory of relativity, a lot of people will not accept it, and they shouldn't unless there is extraordinary evidence. So I think that it would take a long time, maybe not a full lifetime. I'm not sure we will get a definite detection. I mean, if we can manage to go to Enceladus, for instance, I think we could find bacterial life, definitely. But if we're just talking about spectra, I think it has to build up over a long time.
Oh, well, thank you again, Maria. This was really interesting.